Great to see a crowd here. Thank you all for joining us, and apologies to those of you for whom this is standing room only, but you'll be glad that you stuck around for this. So welcome, and welcome to those of you who are visiting the law school. So let me just offer a few words of introduction. This is the Stanley H. Mervis Lectureship in Intellectual Property. This was created in memory of Stanley Mervis back in 2003 by his family and friends. Mr. Mervis was a member of the William & Mary Law School class of 1950. He was also an undergraduate at William & Mary. He got his BS in chemistry. He started his career with the Patent Office in DC as a patent examiner, and then spent most of his career at the Polaroid Corporation. So if you're familiar with Polaroid technology, he was associate patent counsel there. He worked there for 39 years until his retirement in 1993. And during that time, he was responsible for most of the company's patents on both color and black and white instant film. He was involved in litigation that Polaroid had with Kodak. He had 3 of his own patents. It resulted in a victory by Polaroid. He wrote a number of articles and patents and on the topic of instant photography. So we're very grateful that his family has enabled us to offer an annual lecture in intellectual property. We've had a long line of distinguished lecturers who have given the Mervis Lecture in the past, leading thinkers on IP topics, including David Nimmer, Mary Beth Peters, the Honorable Robert Mayer, Pamela Samuelson, the Honorable Pierre Laval, Mark Lemley, Colleen Chen. And this year's speaker continues in that line of distinguished speakers. We're thrilled to have Andrew McLaughlin here with us. Let me just say a few words about Andrew, and then I'll turn things over. Andrew McLaughlin, you may already know, is a true pioneer in the fields of technology, entrepreneurship, and law. His career has spanned just about everything that you would think of in terms of different fields of exploration and different forms of service. He's been Deputy Chief Technology Officer of the United States. He was the head of global public policy at Google. He's been Executive Vice President at Tumblr and Medium, Vice President and Chief Policy Officer at the Internet Corporation for Signed Names and Numbers, ICANN, CEO of Digg and Instapaper. So a career that many of us would only dream of. And he currently serves as Chief Operating Officer of SandboxAQ, which is a company that has the mission of providing AI solutions to address some of the world's most pressing problems. I had an opportunity to have dinner with Andrew last night, and it's just amazing to hear about some of the problems that they're working on that probably could not be solved without this technology. And you're going to hear a little about that today. He's also had a number of academic positions at Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, and served as the founding executive director of the Sci Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale University. So we are absolutely delighted to welcome Andrew today as the 2025 Mervis Lecturer. His talk is "There is no fate but what we make, AI's next frontiers and the policy gaps ahead." Please join me in welcoming Andrew McLaughlin.
Thank you so much. It's amazing to see what free lunch will do for a lunchtime talk. So the kind of organizing principle of this talk, the kind of inspirational theme taken from Terminator 2, is this, somewhat hackneyed quote: "The future is not set, there is no fate but what we make for ourselves." That quote comes into play when Sarah Connor is contemplating how she's going to respond to the knowledge that thermonuclear war sparked by robots is going to consume humanity unless she does something. She carves it into the table and then sets off to go assassinate scientists that are unwittingly responsible for what's about to come. But anyway, the quote in the movie is sort of laid out as this kind of acknowledgement that the future is a product of what we do now, that the shape of the future, the direction of the future is a consequence of the actions that we can take ourselves. And so the kind of options that I'm going to be laying out today are the sort of option A for the future of technology and humanity, or option B, and which way we will choose to go. The irony, by the way, of the Terminator movies is that having laid out this principle that, we can control what happens, people become aware of what the future could be if they don't take action. Nevertheless, every movie ends in thermonuclear war and a collapse into anarchy and oblivion at the hands of robots. So anyway, my theme though is, there is no fate. We should have no fatalism. AI, which is, unfolding around us right now, is not some kind of inevitable force. It doesn't have an inherent logic. It's something that we design. It's something that we build. And it's something that we can choose to direct towards good or not. But so the talk today is to dig into the question of like, actually, do we know what AI is? Do we know where it's going? And so I'm going to make three arguments today. I'm going to try to lay out first a normative case that the kind of AI that is dominant in the public consciousness and awareness right now is not actually going to prove all of that useful, all that sturdy, compared to emerging flavors of AI that are much more rigorous, much more interesting, and anchored in science. I'll explain why. And then this new flavor of AI, I think, is going to raise all kinds of interesting policy and legal questions that sort of compound the ones which are starting to become clear in the context of language models. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about the geopolitical implications of these technologies. All right, so what I mean by next generation AI, I'm going to use the phrase quantitative AI. Some people will say scientific AI. Sometimes when I'm trying to explain it to policymakers, I'll contrast large quantitative models with large language models. But the right way to think about it is that it's a family of architectures, models, techniques, methodologies that are designed to anchor AI in the way that the world really works at a mathematical and scientific level. All right, but so let's get there by talking about large language models and what they are and what they're not. So this is kind of like a classic question, you know, about AI. Can anybody in here tell which of these faces is fake? Any guesses? Number one. It's a trick question. They're all fake. These were all generated by AI. Okay, so what is AI? AI, it's a branch of computer science that is focused on developing computer systems that can perform tasks that mimic and go beyond human capabilities. The key word there being mimic. They are not actually human capabilities. Artificial intelligence, as we're experiencing it today, and ChatGPT and Perplexity and these other kinds of tools, is the product of a kind of conjoining of a huge number of disciplines. Like an incredible amount of science and research and different branches of technological development have come together into what we now understand as artificial intelligence. There's a whole bunch of ways to tell this story, but I'll just tell my version of it very simply, which is that the broad shift over the last couple of years has been going from rules-based systems to generative systems. So the old style approaches used to basically say, okay, we're going to classify email as spam or not spam, and the way that they would do that is just write an ever-growing list of if-thens and complicated strings of if-thens to try to say, like, this is what distinguishes this email as spam, contains the word sale. But it didn't work very well, it doesn't scale very well. It requires humans to kind of think through what the rules are. And then the methodology that has emerged and kind of fits and starts really since the early 1970s through some long periods of winter, of stagnation in research and technological development is a sort of a generative AI approach where we can train statistical models on millions of examples and let the models figure out themselves what the rule set should be. That's what generative AI does. I'm just going to quickly detour because I think this is like interesting and like not the sort of thing that we sort of focus on enough. But the model for generative AI, the model architecture, is really the human brain. Like we're trying to mimic certain aspects of the way the brain functions. So the way the brain functions, if you haven't taken biology in a while, is like super interesting. The neuron, which is the kind of like central, thinking cell of the brain, is part of the nervous system, and it basically is a way for signals to come in, and then a decision to get made about whether a signal should go out. That's the way that a neuron works. A neural network, so the brain, is a whole bunch of cells where signals come in, and then there's a function in the nucleus of the cell that decides whether to send the signal out along the axon. So the artificial neuron in a neural net basically does the same thing, or at least we're trying to make it do the same thing. So you get something in to the artificial neuron like what you would get into a brain neuron. And then we use math to try to understand the strength of the signal coming in. And then there's something called an activation function, which is a decision about whether to send a signal out to the next layer of the neural net, So you've got your lower layers heading to your upper layers, and at each layer, the neuron getting the signal is trying to decide whether it should send it on. Anyway, this sounds very abstract. It's crazy that this works. But anyway, when you add lots of neurons, like millions, in lots of layers, call it like, 64, you can mimic the way that the brain processes things like vision, books, speech. It's nuts that this works, and it does. The result of all of this, though, is an artificial neural network where you start with inputs on the left, you move towards your outputs on the right, and in between, the various layers and the various little nodes within the layers, the little artificial neurons, are sending signals, making decisions about which way to send them and how strong each signal should be. And when you add it all up, you get brain-like outputs. Very cool. So this, by the way, is what it looks like in spreadsheet form. Like, we talk about these models as though they are, these kind of like highly abstract things, but you can actually like do a spreadsheet type output. It's basically matrix algebra, a branch of linear algebra, and a whole bunch of coefficients to the variables. That's really what a neural net is. Anyway, so here's the interesting thing. Deep learning draws inspiration for the brain, but it is much simpler. So even though we've been making all of this progress with GPUs and large language models and so forth, they are not even really remotely close to the level of complexity of the brain. Each neuron can have thousands of axons, thousands of other cells that it's connected to, dendrites and axons. And even in the most sophisticated models now, GPT-4, GPT 4.5, you might have like 100 billion parameters, which is a way of saying the kind of like weights and measures the kind of coefficients to those variables. But the number of synapses in in the brain is like in the quadrillions. Like your brains are really, really wildly interconnected cells that can send signals to each other. We're not even close to that. It's a model might have a couple million, kind of equivalent neurons at a given layer, and all sorts of connections going between them layer to layer, but mathematically it's not even close to the level of complexity. So anyway, the result of all of this is that we've seen a rise in the rise of generative AI. So traditional programming would be, if you wanted to recognize a cat, you would try to like describe it. It's got 4 legs, 2 ears, fur, likes catnip. Starting in 2012, we saw a wave of neural networks start to roll out. And that was all about image recognition. So then you would just sort of ingest tons of images of cats. What we're seeing now with these generative language models is you can like read books about cats, turn that into observations about cats, and then the model can actually understand what is a cat from words and pictures and other things, but a much more sophisticated set of inputs is producing a much more sophisticated set of outputs, which is pretty cool. There's this thing called Moore's law in computing, which is that basically every 18 months, the amount of transistors that you can squeeze onto a chip drops by half. So this is why computing keeps getting cheaper and cheaper. Every generation iPhone gets more and more memory, more and more power. The giant data centers keep packing more and more compute into the same physical spaces, and that's because of this thing called Moore's law. We just make transistors smaller and smaller and smaller, get more compute, and so forth. What's happening with generative AI is the opposite. These models, so people call this Eroom's law, which is Moore spelled backwards. But basically, the size of AI models is increasing dramatically. So we're seeing this kind of like weird thing. Normally in technology, we see ever increasing efficiency. But this is one of those rare examples where we're seeing massively exploding size and complexity. And that will have implications for what we're going to talk about later, because the cost to train these models is going up astronomically, meaning that the number of players that can spend money to create these giant foundation models in generative AI, large language models, is very few. It's a couple of, a handful of global corporations, really. And this gives you a sense, just to sort of show you the number of parameters is a kind of a way to measure the size of a model. Like I said, a parameter is like a weight or a measure as you're going from one layer in a neural net to another. And it's gone just in the last 3 years from 1 billion parameter models as the norm to 20 to 100 to 176, 540. OpenAI has not disclosed how many parameters are in GPT-4, but it's estimated to be about 1 trillion. And that just gives you a sense of how this growth curve is unfolding in front of us. One cool technique that's been making these models a lot more useful is something called fine-tuning. So this is where you start off with a foundation model. So you got your model, you got your computing power, you trained it up on all this text and data. That's your baseline. So that gives you your pre-trained model. But now what you can do is you can take a corpus of knowledge, like let's say chemistry, poetry, Chinese characters, and calligraphy or something like that. And then you can take the model, add compute, add that corpus of knowledge in a sort of like almost like a side routine, and then the model can do a really, really good job at that thing. So we're seeing some specialized models unfolding around the world in the context of like academic disciplines and sciences and stuff like that. That's an advance. So you don't just depend on Wikipedia articles and Reddit posts, which, believe it or not, sometimes are inaccurate. The other thing that's been true about these models is that despite their really, really impressive performance, there are still humans in the loop. There are humans in the loop, meaning that when OpenAI is getting ready to ship a model out to the world, they spend 6 to 9 months throwing lots of human beings at the outputs of the model to try to break it, to try to make it be racist, to try to make it say things that are inaccurate, and then they feed reinforcement back into the model, or they set up guardrails, or they disallow certain kinds of queries, certain kinds of prompts, because these models behave in all kinds of horrific ways because humans are horrible, post horrible things on the internet, the models train on those horrible things. We don't screen in advance of training them. We then try to figure out how to reinforce the good behaviors and exclude the bad behaviors after the model has been trained. That's what's been taking place. This is known as reinforcement learning from human feedback, and anytime you're in ChatGPT and it asks you how it did, or you give it some kind of like feedback on how it did, it takes that and ingests that, and it becomes part of the model, unless you're on a premium account, in which case it doesn't. But anyway, this is just to point out that human beings are intimately involved in the construction, the design, and then the cabining of these models from the things that they could do. And yeah, this is how reinforcement learning, if the model is an agent, it acts and it sees what the response is. Does it get a reward? There are reward systems that are set up for these models so that they get basically like a digital Scooby snack whenever they do something the user likes, and they get told that they've been punished if they do a bad thing, and they try to optimize for the good thing. And they can also these days just observe what the reactions are against a set of standards that you can define that says this is a good behavior or a bad one. Okay, so that's like what's cool. Now let's talk about why I don't actually think that this is the future of AI. Like why I think we've hit a ceiling in what these models can do, and why a new architecture is going to be required and going to be powerful. So one example of a limitation of this approach to models is what's called the data wall. So basically, all of the major models have been trained on all the same content at this point. They are vacuuming in anything that they can get their hands on, and or buying access to databases that are behind a paywall. So they crawl the web, they cut deals with Reddit, they look for social media posts, they ingest videos, they do books, academic journals, Wikipedia, whatever they can get their hands on. And if you're Google or Facebook or whatever you can spend money to get access to, they ingest. But anyway, there is a finite limit to that stuff. And so once you hit that data wall, basically there's no more data, the current models can't improve. They can't improve if they can't learn anything new. And so you can try to make them learn better. You can try to make them extract better conclusions out of what they've been trained on. But there is literally a finite amount of training data for this kind of methodology. Worse, there's the danger of digital slop, basically jacking these models off in directions that you wouldn't want them to go because they produce content that may be wrong or inaccurate. There are right now all kinds of Russian-generated AI web pages that are just designed to pollute models. They're full of propaganda about Ukraine and Ukraine's history and the Nazis in charge and criminality. Just random web pages. Nobody looks at them, but a web crawler will go out and get them, download them, and then maybe ingest that as some kind of authoritative version of history. And so we're facing some version of a data wall. And so as a consequence, LLMs, large language models, are becoming commoditized. They're they're training on the same stuff, they've got the same basic architecture. They're trying to do certain things better. There are approaches like agentic AI, where you take tasks and you stack them in sequence, and you have the AIs do one, and then another, and then another. That can produce some improved outputs for certain kinds of tasks. You know, it's not to say that it's nothing, but they're all basically going in the same directions. They're all hitting the same benchmarks. Start to feel the ceiling, you know, in terms of their performance and their outputs. So this is my summary of the limits of large language models. They're very cool. They are revolutionary. They've done new things. They'll probably be useful for the rest of our adult lives in some way. You know, a kind of like an ability to interact just by talking, chatting, and get results out. That's pretty great. Like, a large language model is useful. But these are the limits. One, the epistemological boundaries. Like, they can't discover what isn't known. Large language models do not make imaginative leaps beyond their training data. What they do is they interpolate from within their training data and give you the best answer that they can, which is why you can say something like, you know, write a note to my mom in the style of Shakespeare that rhymes and references, you know, Three Little Pigs, and apologizes for having crashed the car. And like, it'll do that, because those are all within its scope of knowledge. But if you say, come up with a new form of poetry that's never been seen before, it can't do it. It has no ability to do that in any meaningful way. Okay, so we're stuck with an epistemological zone that can't be expanded. Two, they're stochastic, meaning that they're inherently unstable, inherently random. You know, you can do the same prompt a couple of different times, get different answers, maybe small variations, but there's an inherent randomness to how they work. We don't entirely know why. I mean, like it's sort of inherent in the architecture that as these, you know, signals are zipping up through the different layers of the model, and you end up with these weights, and then you interpolate them. You know, you can't entirely predict that it's always going to happen in the same way. But if you try to use these models for science, you'll be very disappointed. They do not produce, they cannot produce reliable mathematical outputs. Even if you do something like 4 queries off into a special math engine, the models themselves they have no reference model, they have no frame of reference for the universe as it is. They're just unmoored and producing predictive outputs from their data. So again, there's the training data problem that we talked about. Training data is full of biases, has lots of gaps. There's tons of things that it doesn't know. You're always stuck with what you've trained it on. We've all seen hallucinations. There's no explainability. It can't tell you why it came up with something. And you know, in areas like insurance, risk assessment, dynamic product pricing, it can't tell you why it came up with the number, at least not reliably. You may get an output, but you may not know whether that output has any connection to the real reasoning path, if there is one that it took to get there. And then, of course, harmful biases and misinformation are baked into whatever it is that it crawled in that train. So anyway, there are these very powerful limits, and if you're looking for a kind of like reference, there's a chief scientist at Facebook named Jan LeCun. I'm of his school. He has a whole lot of well-elaborated, very present on social media, well-elaborated arguments for why the architectures that we're using have inherent limitations. We can't go beyond them. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what I'm working on, and my argument here is that generally this is the next wave of AI that you should be aware of, and we should generally think through what the implications are going to be. So this is not a sales job for my company. It's just that this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm working on, and this is the case that I want to make. So quantitative AI is basically, you can think of it as a model that is anchored in equations, anchored in physics equations, chemistry equations, biology equations, trained on numbers, and able to produce predictable, deterministic outputs that reflect the world as it is, if you've done it right, like if you've built the model right. So one thing that quantitative AI supports is super multivariable, highly complicated spaces. So if you think about a large language model as an act of compression, right? It took all that data and it basically, through turning it into these weights and biases and really what are mathematical vectors, it compresses all of Wikipedia and Reddit and all the books and everything else, all the images out on the internet into, like, you know, 30 gigabytes. in a model, that's astounding actually, right? Like that's an incredible achievement. We're also doing a big active compression, quantitative AI operators, but we are compressing into like 200 dimensional vectors or 2,000 dimensional vectors or someday 20,000 dimensional vectors. The brain can't really comprehend what 5 dimensions looks like, really 4, although if you've seen Interstellar, you can sort of see an approximation of what it looks like. But mathematically, we know how to represent it. It's called a Hilbert space. And to understand at the molecular level whether an electron is going to form a covalent bond with this other atom, that's an incredibly, incredibly complicated question. You got to know what the nucleus is, what the various forces acting on it are, the magnetism, the gravity, the strong force, the weak force. And to do that, you need to do many dimensional vectors so that the computers can operate and make predictions and understand the behavior of these different systems at the subatomic level. So these are the ingredients: higher dimensional math, fundamental equations, numerical data, deterministic outputs. That's what makes quantitative AI quantitative AI. So large language models predict word sequence. That's the thing they do, is they take your query and try to predict what sequence of, we say tokens bizarrely because it's kind of like letters, but like TR can be a token, or TH can be a token. Anyway, so we say tokens. But quantitative AI models operate fundamentally differently in predicting mathematical principles. So like this would be like a conventional architecture for a large quantitative model. Generative physics equations plus knowledge graphs that include, it can include language, by the way. Like you can ingest a lot of scientific literature into a knowledge graph, but it's fundamentally equations, numbers, and then you can predict how the physical world is going to work. So what do you do with it? Well, in healthcare, there's personalized medicine, meaning that like we can understand your body and try to figure out what drug or whatever makes the most sense for you. AI-powered diagnostic tools. So there's sensors that are extremely sensitive, but if you pair it with quantitative AI, you can pull a useful signal out of that sensor. There's like magnetometers, for example, that can analyze your heart and diagnose what's going on with it. But until recently, they were so sensitive that they were useless. If you're using it in a hospital and there's an elevator, a garbage truck passing by, and people have cell phones, only now do we have the compute power and this quantitative model approach where we can extract signal out of it. Very powerful sensor. There's drug discovery, so understanding at the molecular level what molecule will dock with this protein in the right pocket to do the right thing. That is now possible as a computer simulation in a way that's much more powerful and predictable than we've seen before. In material science, we can do the same kind of molecular simulations to develop catalysts, which are reactants that speed up things that speed up reactions. Superconductors at room temperature, alloys, stronger, lighter metals, let's say, for airplanes. Battery chemistry so that you can pack more energy into a given unit. And then we can model very complex systems, weather systems, energy grids, economies. Okay, so these things are cool. This is a slightly propagandistic slide, but you start off with AI, with language and graphics. In business anyway, it's great for marketing copy. You can do automate customer service. You can write a lot of software code. You can generate media. But you can't do any of the things on the right with a large language model. And my contention is that things are moving economically towards large quantitative models because they're so much more useful for the actual problems that people confront, which are numerical problems, not language problems primarily. This is just to capture like how drug discovery works. I won't spend a lot of time on this, and we can maybe come back to it in questions if people are interested. But basically, the kind of like the process here is you start off with your target, a protein or a virus that you're going to try to go after. And then you try to screen through tons and tons of molecules that conceivably could bind. And then you narrow the field down. That's a screening process. Then you want to find a couple molecules that you really want to go deep on. And that's when you start to try to kind of like optimize their shape. Compounds can be built all kinds of different ways. You can stick a carbon group here, put an oxygen there, shape it all sorts of different ways. You want to find the right structure that will bind with the right point in the target and stay bound. It's a very conventional drug discovery problem. And anyway, the point of this example is that we can screen optimize, co-fold, and this is a new thing that is neat, which is to say understand not only will it bind, but what happens to the protein and what happens to the drug after it's bound, because that'll change its behavior. We can now do that thanks to AlphaFold and some of these other advancements in conventional AI. And then lastly, you want to extrapolate out what else might happen, which means you want to look through the entire body of medical literature to see if anybody has ever looked at this molecule before, if anybody's ever looked at analogs to this molecule and what they do to the body, and repeat the process until you find the right drug. Let's see. This is just I just grabbed a screenshot of like what this looks like on software when you're visualizing it. But you see this is a protein that's associated with diabetes on the left, and this is the computer just running through tons and tons and tons of molecular combinations to try to figure out exactly what molecule will hit the right pocket, dock in the right way, and stay bound. Okay, so now let's step way back. So I've told you why I think LLMs are not the future, why I think quantitative AI is the future. And just to kind of summarize, the big three things that have been happening over the last decade or two is hardware has been getting a lot better. Software, we've been learning how to do proper neural networks that can do this generative sort of analysis and outputs. And we've been unlocking data, enough data, to be able to train these models on the language side and now increasingly on the science side to be able to produce useful outputs. All right, I'm just going to mention, this next one is like just a little bit of a diversion, but I'm just going to mention like a couple of directions that things are going just because I think it's interesting. In the area of quantitative AI, like what's next? Well, one direction is what's called neuromorphic computing, which basically means making our AIs ever more brain-like. So finding more and more features and capabilities of the human brain that we can try to mimic in software. So this is one direction that we're going to be going in. Computers right now have memory, and then they have processing, and they keep those two things separate. The brain doesn't. The brain just has neurons. Memory, processing are all integrated together. So one direction that researchers are going is, can we just build computer models that can process and remember, store data, and work on the data all in the same architecture? The brain is very spike-based, so your neurons aren't always firing all the time, whereas in the world of AI, these models, basically everything fires all the time. And there may be ways to have a much more efficient AI if we can be more like spike-based. The brain parallel processes much better than our computer architectures do. There's even something called local learning, which is, if you think about it, like all these giant models are all being trained and then operated on the same rule set, whereas the brain has corners and pockets of it, zones, where it learns in very different ways, stores data in different ways. You see the signals working in different ways. So it's probably the case that our AI models could learn how to be more locally smart and not have to always do the same thing with the same rule set across their entire architectures. And then there's potential to address, to process scientific data in interesting ways, and we do need things. There are self-learning AI models that are able to basically, like, you don't even have to tell them how to learn, they figure out how to learn. And they keep learning better and optimizing the way that they learn. Okay, but so now let's talk about the legal and policy issues. And I'm just going to lay out basically, I don't have answers in a lot of these areas, but I want to lay out what I think some of the big challenging questions are going to be. So the first one is around the regulation and liability of quantitative AI models. So quantitative AI is much more likely to be used in the kind of scenarios that we've been stressing about, rightly so, with large language models, which is to say, you know, LLMs have been, you know, held back from a lot of parts of the economy so far. They're very new, but it's because they're hallucinatory, they're random, they're unexplainable, they're biased. But when you have an AI that is not random, is not hallucinatory, can give you an explanation and show you the logic tree of how it got to its answer, and is not biased, at least not in the same way that language can produce bias, it's much more likely that we're going to be using it to automate decisions in healthcare, medical treatments, financial market actions, and so forth. And you know, like, so that raises some interesting questions, like, should there be some process for models to be validated and certified? The FDA, you know, approves medical devices, and like, Should it have some role in looking at the underlying quantitative AI models that are going to be powering healthcare decision-making? It's not really expert in software. It's never been expert in software. It's never been like a general purpose kind of like healthcare software regulator, but query whether that should change. The FAA doesn't look at the AI that people use to make airplane materials. And when we start to synthesize new alloys for airplanes, I guess we can just test them normally, but query whether anybody should be looking at the AI, examining the AI, qualifying the AI that goes into it. Same thing with the SEC and financial regulation. They've been trying to understand how to regulate high-frequency trading. What happens when we have high-frequency trading decision-making, not just execution? Will the SEC want to take a look at it? Should they take a look at it? Here's what's crazy, though, to me, is that the thing about modeling the physical world or the human body at the quantum level is that fundamentally, quantum is uncertainty. There is no model that can ever work perfectly at that level because quantum physics is fundamentally uncertain. It's the crazy weird thing about quantum, right? You can't know where that electron is until you look at it or measure it. It seems nuts, it's hard to get your brain around, it's a very tough problem just to kind of like understand as a human how you can not know where an electron is, but you can't. And so there is an inherent level of randomness and uncertainty at the physical universe, at the quantum level. And when you try to model that, that is also going to be the case. You're never going to be able to predict things. And so that raises interesting questions about the allocation of liability. Should we have a strict liability model? And if so, how do you configure it so that you don't disincent people from using these kinds of technologies in useful ways? But we'll have to think about the allocation of harms and the costs for them and the benefits. There's all kinds of fun intellectual property rights questions about ownership. Who owns an AI-generated discovery? Is it the developer of the model, the operator of the model, the researchers and users who are interacting with the model? Is it the pharmaceutical company who's the client? They're writing the check after all, and maybe the money should just dictate here. What about the scientists whose work trained the model? What about all the people whose foundational work went into the training data? There's an easy-ish answer, which is like, economic power is going to figure this out. The IP rights get negotiated, they get turned into contracts, but even though normally it's the case that whoever pays owns the thing, nobody's going to feel like they need to pay for it if there's no right in anybody else to be bought. So it is actually important to figure out a default ownership structure for these inventions. So quickly, on copyrightability, there are all kinds of interesting questions. We normally say that there has to be a human author to qualify for copyright. So should quantitative AI-generated scientific discoveries, predictions, or other outputs qualify if no human directly authored them? Emphasis on the word directly. And then anyway, if so, then who is the author? The creators, the operators, the users, the trainers, the calibrators. One interesting question that's come up is whether there should be moral rights in AI-generated scientific discoveries, which is to say in Europe, there are certain rights that you cannot contract away. We call those moral rights. And the right to be acknowledged, your contributions to be acknowledged, for example. The right of acknowledgement is a moral right in the EU. Maybe it would be smart for us to attach some kind of moral right of acknowledgement when something comes out of an AI model so that we know where it came from. And then you would ask whether moral rights should apply to derivative works built on quantitative outputs. There are some interesting copyright issues around data sources. So if you are taking a copyright class from Professor Heyman, you'll know that there's this Feist decision with phone books, and you can't copyright underlying facts, but you can copyright the arrangement and presentation of those facts. Did I get that right?
You did.
Like AI models are giant databases in one sense, but the weights and biases are basically expressed as vectors that don't actually map directly to any given fact because every weight and bias is being adjusted with each new fact that you stuff into it. And so you end up with something which is a kind of like approximation of all the data that came in where no particular node is exactly the same as anything that went in. And yet, this thing can sometimes produce an exact New York Times story, as we've seen in the copyright litigation, but not always. Anyway, very weird to try to figure out how to apply a database copyright analysis to these things. And then generally, there's a kind of policy question about whether we should use copyright law to impose obligations for credit or compensation on this part of the economy. The models themselves, we've got some rules around human-written software, but increasingly software is written by AI agents. You can imagine a complete AI model architecture in which not one line of code has been written by a human being typing, buttons on a keyboard. And so in that case, would any of the copyright protections that we've elaborated around software apply to the models? And if not, what should the rule set be? There are some plausible frameworks for copyright analysis here, and I won't go through them in detail, but there's like a merger doctrine where if the model weights are the only practical way to perform a function, then maybe they're not copyrightable because the ideas, the facts that are underneath them and the expression of those facts are merged inseparably, in which case no copyright unless we go past some new law. There are some other tests, the abstraction filtration comparison test from the Altai case, transformative use, the black box problem. These are all wrinkles in copyright analysis that we would need to sort out. Copyrightability of AI-generated research and reports. Who gets the copyright when you do a deep research report on Gemini or ChatGPT? There are all kinds of interesting patent issues. They harmonize with the copyright issues. A lot of the same issues that I won't go to in gory detail, but AI as inventor, ownership of AI-generated patents, the quantitative models themselves, can the architectures be patented? It's model weights, the training methods. There's an interesting question around incentives, like should we shorten patent terms because invention itself is going to become so much cheaper and faster? Do we need 14-year, 20-year patent monopolies on inventions? Might that become a much more noticeable barrier to innovation if the underlying pace, speed, and cost gets a lot better? And then there's also, what happens if I set an AI up to basically just crank out an infinite number of molecules with possible indications that they might go along with? Does that create prior art which basically blocks anybody else from ever inventing anything on top of those published molecules? Does it make everything obvious? If I publish it and it came out of an open source AI model, let's say quantitative AI model, or even a proprietary one, does that suddenly make the invention obvious so that it can't be patented in the future? All right, and here's my last note, which is about the geopolitical implications of all this. So I think that this technology is the next big wave. Scientific AI, scientifically rigorous AI. I think that it has huge implications for the structure and arrangement of power around the world. I would love it if we all thought about it as basically an engine for scientific advancement, resource optimization, economic transportation, but humans being humans and living in this moment right now where we are erecting the borders, tearing apart trade relationships and so forth, it's inevitable that the geopolitical nation-state competition, the Westphalian nation-state competition that unfolds around us, is going to try to secure advantage through this technology. And so it's, to me, clear that the nations that have the strongest quantitative AI capabilities in biotechnology, material science, complex modeling, will actually have strategic advantages. It doesn't do away with the importance of military power, but it kind of transcends military power. So, one implication is the AI is strategic assets. So we see, China, US, EU all competing for AI dominance. We've seen concerns about scientific hegemony. So basically, like the developing world, less resource-rich countries are rightly worried that the richest countries will monopolize this technology and use it as a cudgel to extract resources or lord it over them in whatever way. The countries that can do fusion energy first or carbon capture best, will have stronger economies and cleaner environments than the ones that can't. And if the technology itself is so, expensive, difficult, innovative, or whatever, it's going to be hard for those benefits to be seized by other nations. And then finally, of course, there's like cybersecurity. there's all kinds of ways that you can use this sort of technology to like attack and defend systems, and then even in kinetic warfare, in the ways that warfighters have access to information and the ability to direct action. The countries that have quantitative AI capabilities will have an advantage. And then there's this is my last question, my last note. So is there anything to stop malevolent actors from using this technology to bioengineer highly lethal pathogens? Not really. I mean, quantitative AI plus CRISPR plus viral synthesis equals deadly pathogen. And those capabilities are increasingly, easy to find around the world. So you've got your state-sponsored bioweapons programs, rogue terrorists and non-state actors, unregulated domestic labs, insider threats inside the existing biotechnology labs that we have. And then is there any way to regulate this? I mean, sort of. I mean, we try to regulate models and who has access to them. We have this kind of notion of dual-use technologies for things that can be used for good or for ill, which is largely anything technological. And we try to restrict exports of these powerful technologies to our adversaries. But you can't really block the export of a paradigm or a framework. You can't really block software, at least not in any effective way. You can try to stop other countries from having data centers large and powerful enough to be able to run it. But anyway, one thing that is clear to me is that chip export restrictions, which is what the last administration was focused on, and I'm almost certain this administration will also try to focus on, don't work. And we don't have time today for me to run through the whole kind of like chip discussion, but we are trying to keep chips from being exported to China and other adversarial nations, Russia as we see them, and it's having no effect. There's a black market, a gray market, there's domestic producers. That is not how we're going to stop it. So, just flipping to the end, so what's it going to be? Is it going to be future A, future B, or more likely, future C? The answer is up to us. Thank you.
Fantastic. And on that uplifting note, we have some time for questions. So yeah, let's start in the back.
So we went over artificial neural networks as a way to build large language models. Do you think we're going to need a fundamentally different structure to build large quantitative models?
Yeah, so we don't need it, but I hope we'll get one anyway. So what we're doing, what most of the people that I know that are building quantitative AI are doing is we're junking transformers. We don't need it. We're not doing language, but we are using neural net architectures. The fantasy that I have is that quantum computing will turn into a real thing. So if you're trying to do infinite dimensional math, Hilbert space type math, you would love a quantum computer. So I'll throw a huge party when those things reach maturity and we can start to use quantum computers, which are super, super, super well designed for this kind of problem. But until then, we basically are stuck, I think, with some version of neural nets and some infrastructure like giant GPU GPU infrastructures in data centers.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I know you mentioned that you don't think export controls work, but do you think massive restrictions through stuff like CFIUS is a good way to prevent adversaries from getting access to this sort of data or training these things? Do you have any thoughts about outbound investment restrictions in this space?
Yeah, well, the question. So so for you want to say what CFIUS is for people who don't know?
Foreign investment in the U.S. is an investment screening. I took a class on this too, so this is niche knowledge, but it's effectively investment screening body who reviews certain acquisitions from foreign investors or foreign companies in sensitive technologies.
It's if a non-American entity or individual wants to buy into a key technology in the U.S., they have to get approval from the government. Basically, that's the committee that organizes it. I don't see how that helps at all, right? Like I just don't like. If you want to make the argument, I'm all ears, but I don't see how investment restrictions in any way limits the transfer of these technologies. Why? Because there's a domestic chip industry in China that is like, we don't have that much of an advantage. Like, it is catching up. Their AIs are hitting all of our benchmarks. I'm sure everybody saw the news about DeepSeek, way cheaper, just as powerful, developed in China. Maybe they had some black market NVIDIA chips, but who cares? It won't be long before they've got their own infrastructures to run on. So that's not going to do it. If you want to stop lethal biopathogens from being developed, we actually like would need to coordinate, like cooperate, not put walls up, leave alliances and stuff like that. Maybe that's my controversial like geopolitical note, is basically like the only way that transnational problems can be dealt with is by transnational cooperation, unless somebody's got a better idea.
Yeah, in the back.
Given how much more accessible these things are becoming, both in terms of accessing the models themselves you're talking about, it seems much cheaper and more quickly to get what we have here, and how challenging it is to regulate these things both domestically and internationally, like you were just talking about. Do you think that is there anything we can really do effectively, and do you think we're in a place to make it happen, or are we just really back in the Wild West again?
I can actually put a gloss on that question. So, I mean, you've served at high levels in administration, right, with the government. So if you were in that kind of role, what would you say is the next step? What would you say that we should do?
Yeah, so I don't despair, right? Like I don't think that this is something that we should be like deeply terrified of or whatever. In fact, like to be very clear, like synthesizing, an offensive bioweapon is not easy. Even if you've got the ability to like design a molecule in silico, the capabilities that we have are not widely shared. They're not widely understood. But let's assume that they will be. It still is hard to actually like create a scalable pathogen. So that's good news. In terms of regulation, though, what you would want is you would want a combination of a governmental operating capability to be able to engage in countermeasures. So what I mean by that is we ought to actually have the ability, like right now, American forces are bombing Houthis in Yemen. Whether you think that's good or bad, it's a capability that we have. So we have a capability to like see something and then blow it up. And one of the things that I think, the kind of like responsible nations, and I'm not saying whether this one is or not at this point, but let's suppose that there was a coalition of responsible nations, they ought to have a very high level of awareness of what's going on around the world, to be able to see where large data center infrastructures are emerging and being built, where chips are going. That requires, intelligence service cooperation. It requires, the kind of stuff that we've done in the case of nuclear threats, let's say, which is trying to understand where all the things are happening, like what's happening in Iran's nuclear labs or the Soviet Union back in the day. There are kind of like well-established mechanisms to like understand what's happening in the world and then, if necessary, take action to stop it from happening. And I think that a nuclear proliferation threat gives you some sense of what those things might be. They are all rooted, though, in forms of international cooperation where you join together to share intelligence and take joint action. So anyway, domestic regulation, I actually think it would be smart to start to regulate outputs and require things like explainability, require things like model transparency. We can regulate the insurance industry or the banking industry to say if you're taking this kind of a decision and you're using AI, you have to disclose it. You have to provide the following, logical trees to explain how you're coming up with these answers. Those kinds of things are actually very doable. I don't see much appetite to do them right now, but it would strike me as a smart thing to do as they start to proliferate around the sectors of the economy that can use them.
Elizabeth, you had a question.
Just kind of jumping off of that, who do you think is the most qualified to insert these regulations? I know you were saying about like that thing, the SEC, they don't have the expertise required to really get what they need. Do you think that those pathways are courts, through Congress, through the agencies?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess we're ending our experiment with the administrative state currently. So, what I'm about to say may be an out-of-date answer. But generally, what we do in this country is we have sector-specific regulators that develop the necessary expertise to regulate those sectors. I think that's probably not the craziest model. I don't think, like a horizontal AI regulator is a good idea, in part for sort of obvious regulatory capture and other kinds of like standard reasons why regulators fail, but the idea of expert regulation within a given field strikes me as probably the right model. And to do that, you would need to actually start to have expertise in-house, and then craft regulations which in the typical kind of American style, when they're done right, are pretty lightweight, pretty flexible, pretty principles-based, and then elaborated through case-by-case adjudication. I would think that's probably the best way to do it.
One question I had, I guess, was in terms of, or maybe two parts, is in cybersecurity for specifically, we have, I guess the biggest example, I guess, there's one data company that uses a series of lava lamps on a wall and the color and everything to design their passwords or protections and so on. And we have the quantitative model as they're coming across and getting smarter and smarter. Is there a question of the, not even, dealing with it, something like a dangerous neurotoxin or something developed, but in terms of a cybersecurity threat that would just disable or be smarter or, I don't know, be able to breach any security system, do you run into the problem of, oh, well, we have this AI that's, going and attacking everything else, we have another AI that's going and attacking something else, and I guess the, not the, I don't want to say it's dead parent kind of thing, but in that same where everything is AI fighting itself in the same kind of way, itself in the same kind of way, where do you think?
Right. Well, there is one thing that that's along those lines that I will just alert everyone here to, which is, I mentioned quantum computers. So quantum computers are like this whole other thing, right? It's an effort to take the bit of a computer, which is normally a 1 or a 0, and basically make it be kind of like infinite because of the way that a quantum, what's called a qubit, can be anything in between a 0 and a 1. And that's what makes it super cool for parallel computing. Quantum computers, we know, are going to be able to crack all the encryption standards that we're using right now. So that is totally coming at some point. The Chinese are, aggressively building quantum computing infrastructures for, scientific purposes, but also we suspect to be able to decrypt. We're doing the same thing, I'm sure. It's kind of like a Y2K problem. You're all too young to remember what this was, but there's weird computer bugs that we had to upgrade all the code that the world was running on in 2000. But we don't know what the date is. Like, we don't actually have a clear deadline. Quantum computers could mature in 5 years, 10, 15, who knows? I think it's going to be 5 or less, by the way. But anyway, when that comes, quantum computers will be able to decrypt, all the encryption used on Bitcoin and the blockchain, all the decryption used to protect email, website transactions, and all that sort of stuff. The good news is the US standards body called NIST has got a full suite of quantum-resistant algorithms that are available, ready for upgrade, and people are starting to do it. If you have an iPhone, I think your iPhone is already baked in with quantum-resistant cryptography. So they're getting ahead of the curve. That's great. But what you're talking about is, coming waves of attack from quantum computers. I can see it. From AI, no, we still are stuck with the underlying GPU compute infrastructures that make. I'm not worried about the lava lamp random number generator getting cracked by AI, even quantitative AI. It has to do with the way that you factor, large numbers, and AI can't improve on what a GPU platform can do.
Andrew, can I ask you, just because we're just about out of time, but because we have obviously a lot of students in the room, just to reiterate something that we've talked about earlier. So, this has been an incredibly fascinating talk, tons of information. You've conveyed how important it is to get familiar with this stuff. So what can students in the room do? What should their next step be to be prepared as future professionals, given everything you've told us?
Yeah, so I went to law school. I'm a lawyer. I'm a malpracticing lawyer that you wouldn't want to trust with anything real. But just because you have a law degree doesn't disable you from learning technical and scientific stuff. So one bit of advice that I have that I relayed to some students earlier is, because I've been doing this myself, I just did a drug discovery course, an online drug discovery course that Harvard makes available.
Just to clarify, that's not how to discover drugs out there. It's
exactly right. That's been my adult life since I was 16 has been some version of drug discovery. But yeah, that's not what I meant. I just went through, if you're interested, there's an online Harvard drug discovery course that goes through the whole process. It was awesome. I learned it. I can now talk about it. It seems like I'm not an idiot. And similarly, I'm a big fan of formal education, even if you're a practicing lawyer. If you want to angle your career in some direction, go learn stuff and learn it formally. There's an amazing universe of free courses, paid courses, certifications. Just because you graduate with your JD doesn't mean that you won't benefit career-wise or even just personally from committing to learn a field or an area that you think is interesting. The second thing I'll say is, there's so much cool stuff that you can do with AI in your own life. It is worth screwing around with it so that you don't feel like you're disabled, that you're disabled from having opinions about artificial intelligence and how it works and what it can do. It's worth leaning into. I think it's totally going to be part of your futures as adults, and it is something that it's worth not feeling like you're unempowered around. So those are my 2 suggestions.
Fantastic. Well, learned a ton. This was absolutely fascinating. Join me again in thanking Infinite.